Today we have some more actual history about colonial times on the western frontier of Virginia. We will hear about another group of pioneer settlers who were attacked in their homes near present-day Radford, Virginia, by a group of Shawnee Indians on July 30th, 1755. They captured a woman named Mary Draper Ingles, who was a mother about 23 years old at the time. We are going to be reading one of the only accounts of this attack, written by her son, Colonel John Ingalls, in 1824. He was the youngest of the Draper children, born in 1766, well after the events of this story took place. His account is based on the accounts his mother gave of the attack. Ingalls' story was transcribed by the Boone County Public Library in 2008. To give some more information on Colonel Ingalls' account, I will now read the first paragraph of the introduction, written by James Duval for the Boone County Public Library in Burlington, Kentucky. We will then hear John Ingalls' account of his mother's captivity in 1755. The story of Mary Ingles is the most inspiring of all the great mass of Indian captivity stories, some of them published early, and in many editions, which have come down to us. During Mary's lifetime, the story did not have a wide circulation outside of the area where she lived. The first publication for general circulation that I can find is in the Southern Literary Messenger, Volume 19, 1853. The well-known Virginia-based magazine, once edited by Edgar Allan Poe. The manuscript of which this is a transcription was written by Mary's son, Colonel John Ingalls, about 1824, at the encouragement of Thomas Ingalls, Jr., and is based on the memories of the many accounts he had heard from his father William and older family members, but particularly from his mother Mary, who delighted to tell the story as she grew older. It is primarily this manuscript that has kept her journey from entering the twilight of myth and legend, and escaping the realm of history. At the repeated solicitations of my relations and friends, of which letters in my possession are sufficient evidence, I have consented to write the following short history. The application has been made to me as I am the only branch of my father's family now in existence, who knows of the difficulties and sufferings my father's own family had to undergo at that early day, in attempting to settle this western world. Though the greater part of the transactions to which allusion is made happened long before I was born, yet having heard them so frequently repeated by my father and mother in my early days, they made such deep and lasting impressions on my youthful mind that they will never be forgotten by me as long as I live, and I believe are as fresh in my memory at this day as they ever were. I will therefore endeavor to give a short but correct narrative of the scenes through which they had to pass in their first settling on the western waters of Virginia, so far as my recollection serves me at this time, that a record of them may be preserved for the gratification of our friends and rising generation. However fabulous or romantic the narrative may appear in some of its parts to many persons, they are stubborn facts that could have been abundantly established by many eyewitnesses at an early day, it being required. John Ingalls, Sr. My father, William Ingalls, moved to the western part of Virginia sometime about the year 1750. With my grandfather George Draper, his father-in-law and his family, and settled nearly on the top of the Allegheny Mountains, at a place then called Draper's Meadows, now called Smithfield, and at this time owned by Colonel James Preston. At that time there were but few families of any besides their own, on the west side of the Allegheny in this section of the country. However, other families shortly after immigrated to it, and made scattering settlements at some distance from each other, and continued to enjoy peace and harmony among them for 3 or 4 years. In the meantime, there had been several parties of the northern Indians, to wit, the Shawnees, who passed by where my grandfather lived, on their way to the south, and would commit depredations on the Catawba Indians, but they were still friendly to the whites at that time. However, this happy state of things did not last long. The Indians found out that they could gratify their heathen thirst for bloodshed and plunder much nearer home, and at length commenced a warfare on the frontier settlements, and at a time it was little expected, a party of Shawnees fell in upon my father's family, and on my uncle's family, John Draper, which lived at the same, and killed several, and took the balance prisoners, to wit, my mother and her 2 children, Thomas and George, and Aunt Draper, and others. My grandfather Draper, being a widow at that time and living with my father, was killed, as was Colonel Patton, who was there, who had a large claim of land on the western waters. He was killed also, and some other persons not recorded. My mother and her 2 children, Thomas the older 4 years old, George about 2 years old, were taken as prisoners. Also my Aunt Draper, who was wounded in her arm, it broken by a ball, which was shot at her in attempting to escape, as well as several others. It so happened they made the attack on their harvest day, and although there were several men at the place, the Indians took the advantage of attacking the house while the men were at their work in the harvest field. And the field being some distance from the house, they knew nothing of the attack until it was entirely out of their power to render any service to the family. My father, hearing the alarm, ran up very near to the house, thinking perhaps he might render some service in some way, although entirely unarmed. The Indians discovering him, 2 stout active Indians took after him with their tomahawks, expecting to outrun him and kill him, and were very near effecting their purpose, and nothing but a providential act saved him. While the Indians were pursuing him and gaining on him very fast, one on each side at some distance, running through the woods where it was a little thick with brush and undergrowth. Fortunately, in jumping over a log, he fell. The Indians, being so eager in pursuit, overran him. My father, on rising, immediately tacked back the other way, and by that means made his escape. As there was no chance for what white men that were there to render any relief to the prisoners, the Indians, securing all the guns they had, which were in the house, and so few settlers in the country, and them so far distant apart, that they had to abandon all idea of any further pursuit after them. The Indians went effectively unmolested. They gathered up the prisoners and plunder and started, and steered their course down the New River. They made but slow progress in getting on, as their way was much impeded by the thickness of the forest and undergrowth, which covered the whole country. However, on striking New River, they pursued on down it. The Indians, having several horses along, packed with their plunder which they had taken, and the prisoners, met with considerable difficulty in getting on, and the prisoners very roughly treated. However, from some cause, my mother said that they always treated her with more respect than any of the other prisoners, and permitted her to ride on one of the horses for the greater part of the road, and to carry her children. Though my Aunt Draper, who had her arm broken, was principally put under her care, and my mother had to dress her wound and procure stuff to dress it, and she would frequently be sent off by herself into the woods to hunt the wild comfrey to put to the broken arm, and would be gone a considerable time, and she said she might have had frequent opportunities of leaving them, but could not think of leaving her children, still harboring a hope that they might be pursued, or they might be released altogether in some way or other. They still worked on in this way until they got down some little distance above the mouth of the Great Kanawha. They came to a little salt spring in the bank of the river. The Indians stopped there, and rested for a day or two, and with what kettles they had with them, boiled and made some salt. They then started on from there, and pursued their journey until they got to the nation, where the Indians lived, which was at the mouth of the Big Scioto, and which took them about 1 month to perform, from the time they were taken until they arrived at the nation. The next day after they got to the nation, the prisoners had to undergo the Indian custom of running the gauntlet, which was performed by forming 2 lines of all the Indians in the nation, men, women, and children, and the prisoners to start at the head of the 2 rows formed, and ran down between the lines. And every Indian gave them a cut or a pelt with switch sticks, or such things as they could provide, which was a very severe operation, and especially to my Aunt Draper, whose arm had not got near well from the wound she had received when she was taken prisoner. However, my mother said she was excused from the punishment, and although she was treated with considerable dignity, more than the other prisoners met with, all the comfort left her was the hope that she might keep her 2 children with her, and to render them such service as occasion might need. However, a few days baffled all her hopes. The Indian party collected in a few days, and made a division of all the prisoners, and her children were taken away from her, and consigned to different owners, and were not permitted to associate together at all. Though trying as this circumstance was to her, she was obliged to bear it, and she wore on under her affliction in the best way she could. It so happened that there were some French traders from Detroit with some goods, trading with the Indians,
and as linen or check shirts were great articles among the Indians, and as my mother was a very good sewer, she undertook to make some shirts for the traders, at times when she was not employed in other ways. And as shirts were a scarce article among the Indians, and one very much prized among them as a dress, her permanence pleased them, so that they would do anything for her to get a shirt made. And the Frenchmen, finding it a considerable advantage to them in selling their check and linen to the Indians, encouraged her very much. And when she made a shirt for one of the Indians, they would stick it upon a stick, and run all through the town to show it, and praise my mother for what a fine squaw she was. Then the Frenchman would make the Indian go to their store and pay her in goods, to at least twice the value of the shirt. She continued on making shirts for them in this way, while she stayed in this town, which was 2 or 3 weeks, and was making money very fast. At about that time, a party of the Indians started to the Big Bone Lick, which is now in the state of Kentucky, and took my mother and several other of the prisoners to make salt. My mother being so distressed in being separated from her children, and her situation such a disagreeable one, that she came to the determined resolution that she would leave them and try to get home, or die in the woods, and prevailed on an old Dutch woman that was there, and a prisoner too, to engage with her in the seemingly hopeless and daring attempt. And as my mother was determined to make the attempt, they arranged their plan, which was to get leave of the Indians to go out a piece from the lick, with a view to hunt and gather some grapes, and provided themselves with a blanket and tomahawk apiece, and perhaps a knife, and for fear of being suspected took no other kind of clothing, only what was on them, and those a good deal worn, and started. And as the Big Bone Lick was 90 or 100 miles farther off than the town, and some little distance from the Ohio River, they started in the after part of the day, and steered their course to strike the Ohio River, which was all the guide they had to direct them. I have frequently heard my mother say that when she left the lick that she exchanged her tomahawk with one of the 3 Frenchmen, who were all sitting on one of the large bones that was there, cracking walnuts. At night, the 2 women not returning, the Indians became very uneasy, thinking they had got a little off from the camp and were lost, and used every exertion to find them, not mistrusting them off, and when they could not find them, concluded they had perished in the woods, or been killed by some wild beast. This last circumstance was related to my father by some of the Indians who attended the treaty at Point Pleasant, after the Battle of the Point, and was the first time the Indians had heard of what became of my mother and the old Dutch woman. However, on their getting to the river, they pursued on up it, and in the course of 4 or 5 days, reached the Indian town, or rather on the opposite side of the Ohio River. There was a little corn raised and a cabin. They lay in the cabin all night, and there was in the cabin some corn. They ate of it, and in the morning, when they were about starting, there happened to be a horse beast in the lot adjoining the cabin. They concluded to take it and pack on it what corn they could to help them along. They did so, and then started in again, with the beast and corn, and steering on up the river and in sight of the Indian town. And what was very extraordinary, they saw several Indian hunters that day, and they so secreted themselves that they never discovered them. There was a little river that emptied into the Ohio, to wit, the Licking River, and on the side they were, it was too deep for them to wade. All their chance was to travel up it until they could find a passage, and after traveling up Licking 2 or 3 days, found a place where the freshets had drifted up timber across, that afforded themselves a passage. But as to how to get their beast over, they were at a loss. At length the old Dutch woman insisted she could take it over on the drift pile, and made the attempt. But after getting it on a piece, the beast fell in among the logs, and there they had to leave it. They then took what corn they could carry themselves, then moved down until they struck the Ohio again, and then pursued on up the Ohio. And thus was the course that they had to pursue upon every stream of water that came in their way of any size, of which there were several. And they could never have surmounted that difficulty, had it not been at a season of the year when the watercourses were very low, and more so than common at the season. Even in this they were obliged to travel several days' journey, at several of them before they could wade them, and then down again to the Ohio, which was their only guide. They frequently, in passing up and down those streams to find a passage, when they found the river made a bend, and point of ridges making in, would attempt to cross those points of ridges, to shorten the distance, and by being worn down by failure and starvation, would have to pull themselves up by the shrubs and bushes till they got to the top, and to descend they would slide all the way down. Under these difficulties, having nothing to sustain nature but what they picked up in the woods, such as black walnuts, grapes, pawpaws, etc., and very often so pushed with hunger that they would dig up roots, and eat that they knew nothing of. And in all this extremity, the old Dutch woman, getting disheartened and discouraged, got very ill-natured to my mother, and made some attempts to kill her, blaming my mother for persuading her away, and that they would die in the woods. And as she was a good deal stouter and stronger than my mother, she used every means to try to please the old woman, and keep her in a good humor, and at length got to the mouth of the Great Kanawha, where they had performed but very little more than one half of their journey. However, they persevered on up the Kanawha, in the same manner as they did the Ohio, until they got within 40 or 50 miles of where my mother was taken prisoner from. Then the old woman became more ill-natured, and made another attempt to kill my mother, and she thinks would have effected it, had not my mother, by accident, got loose from the old woman, and being somewhat more active, outran her. This happened in the evening just before dusk. My mother, in making her escape, slipped under the river bank, and hid herself until after dark, and hearing nothing more of the old woman, she crossed out, and in looking about, the moon giving a little sight, espied a canoe at the bank of the river, which was the same the Indians had taken them across in on their way down. On examining the canoe, she found it pretty much filled up with leaves and dirt which had blown into it, but she could not find a pole or paddle in it. She, crawling up on the bank, luckily came across a thin slab which came off of a tree, which had been blown down and shattered by the wind. She took the slab and went to the canoe, and cleaned out the leaves and dirt, then pushed off the canoe from the bank and got in it. And although she never had any knowledge of steering or working a canoe before, after making several trials found she could steer her on, and finally crossed the river to the other side, it being a place where some hunters had made a little improvement and built a cabin the spring before, and had planted some corn. But the buffaloes and wild beasts had destroyed all the corn. However, my mother got into the cabin and slept. In the morning when she got out, she was examining about the little corn patch to find some corn, or something she could eat, and she discovered a little turnip or two which had escaped the wild beasts. She pulled them and ate. And at that time the old woman, who was on the opposite side of the river, saw my mother and hallooed to her, and begged very hard of my mother to come over to her again, that she would not do her any harm. However, loath as my mother was to leave her, after reflecting on how the old woman had treated her, she thought perhaps the old woman might kill her, and concluded that as she was out of reach of her, she had best to keep so. And from the hunters who had made the settlements where she was before she was taken, had gathered some idea of the distance she still had to perform, and that the balance of the way she would have to travel was a very rough one, and although the little clothing which she had started with was nearly or entirely worn out, or dragged off of her by the brush on her long journey, and her moccasins entirely worn out, that she had become utterly naked, and the weather growing cooler, that her prospect of succeeding was almost a hopeless one. However, her resolution bore her up, and she pursued on, and to add to her difficulty, there fell a little snow, and all the chance she had for keeping herself from perishing at night was to hunt out in the evening a hollow log or a tree, and gather leaves and put in it, and then crawl in amongst the leaves and lie. And after pursuing on in this manner for 4 or 5 days, after leaving the old woman, traveling through the frost and wading waters, and round cliffs of rocks that made in close to the river, she became so frosted, and her limbs so swelled, that it would have been impossible she could have got any further, but that kind Providence, which had sustained her through a journey, estimated to be not less than 700 to 900 miles, the route which she was necessarily obliged to travel, exposed to the inclemency of the weather, and ferocity of wild beasts, hunger and starvation, for 42 days in an unknown wilderness, still provided for her relief. It so happened that a man by the name of Adam Harmon and 2 of his sons were at a place on New River, where they had settled and raised some corn that summer, securing their corn and hunting. When my mother got to the improvements, not seeing any house, began to halloa. Harmon, on hearing the voice of a woman, was a good deal alarmed. On listening, being an old neighbor of my mother, and well acquainted with her voice, said to his sons it certainly was Mary Ingles' voice, and knowing that she was taken prisoner by the Indians, he was suspicious there might be Indians with her. Him and his sons caught up their guns and ran to where my mother was, and you may expect it was a joyful meeting, especially to my mother. However, as they got her onto their cabin, she was entirely exhausted and worn out by exposure and starvation. Harmon, having plenty of fresh venison and bear meats, began to have some cooked for her, and having a pretty good knowledge of her situation, would not suffer her to eat more than a few mouthfuls at a time, and by changing her victuals in different forms and soups, giving her but a little at a time, to nourish her up. My mother said although Harmon had ever so much fresh venison and bear meats in the house, that he did on the next morning have a fine fat little beef killed, to make beef soup for her, and by bathing her feet and legs got her in a day or two to where she could travel. Having several horses there, he fixed one up for her to ride, and brought her on up to the Dunkard bottom, where the fort was, and the only one near, and where all the people that were in the country had collected. Thus ended her trials and difficulties of nearly 5 months, from the time she was taken prisoner, and 42.5 days of that time when returning back in the wilderness. When my mother fell in with Harmon, she related to him the circumstances of leaving the old woman behind, and what had transpired, and tried to prevail on him to send his sons in pursuit of her. But from understanding the treatment which she had received from the old woman, he refused to go. However, the old woman was more lucky than my mother was. A little above where my mother left her, the old woman fell in at another place, where some hunters had made a settlement and built a cabin. The hunters had but just left the place, and had left a kettle nearly full of cooked venison and bear meat that the old woman feasted on and rested herself for a day or two. The hunters had also left a pair of small leather shoes, which she also got and drew on, and in addition had left an old horse. Providence seemed to provide for her, the old lady getting some of what is called leatherwood bark, and making a kind of bridle or halter, and caught the old horse and mounted him, and pursued on her journey. But there is one circumstance which occurred, which may seem strange. At the time they stole the horse at the nation to bring off their corn, the beast had on a bell, and when they were obliged to leave the beast in the drift pile, the old woman took off the bell, and brought it with her the whole trip all through her extremity and distresses. However, when my mother got up to the fort, she prevailed on some of the men to go in pursuit of the old woman, and after traveling 15 or 20 miles down New River, met the old woman riding a leg aside on her old horse, with a bell on him open, and every once in a while would hallo, that she might be discovered, in case any person might be near. However, the men took her on up to the fort where my mother was, and it was certainly a joyful meeting, where they were relieved of all their toils and difficulties. At the time my mother got back, my father and Uncle John Draper had been gone some time to the Cherokee Nation of Indians, with a view to get some of them to go to the Shawnees, and to try to purchase their wives and children, or to try to procure their release in some other way, those two tribes being at peace with each other, and thinking this plan might be the most favorable one they could devise. And on the very night after my mother returned to the fort at the Dunkard bottom, my father and Uncle Draper lay within about 7 miles of the fort on their return. And you may guess what was the sensation and feeling of my father and mother at his arriving at the fort the next day, at so unexpected a meeting. However, my Aunt Draper did not get released until about 6 years afterwards. The circumstances of her release is not recollected. However, my father and mother continued at the Dunkard bottom until the next spring, and as the settlers in this country were likely to be harassed by the Indians again that season, my mother became very restless and uneasy, and could not be reconciled to stay there. My father, to gratify her, moved her about 20 miles to another fort, called Voss's Fort, on the head of Roanoke, where there were more families collected, and a much stronger fort, and more men to guard it. But as the Indians were making depredations on the frontiers, she still could not rest reconciled to stay there. My father then moved her down into Bedford County, below the Blue Ridge, and in the course of that fall there was a strong party of French and Indians came on to Voss's Fort, attacked it, and finally took the fort, and killed and captured all the families that were there. and had it not been through the direction of a kind providence that my mother had gone from this fort, she would have fallen into their savage hands again, and would have been killed or taken prisoner the second time. There were some circumstances which I have frequently heard my father relate, as respects two uncles of his, and their families, who were at the fort when it was taken, to wit, John and Matthew Ingles, the former being out from the fort when it was attacked, hearing the firing of the guns, made towards the fort as fast as he could, and on coming in sight, found the fort entirely surrounded by the Indians. His family being in the fort, he made an attempt to rush through the Indians to get to his family, but the Indians, discovering him aiming for the fort, got around him, he still rushing on with his gun in his hands, until they closed in so near that he shot his gun off at them. They then closed in on him, he still beating them off with his gun, until he broke it all to pieces, and then with the barrel, until he got very near to the fort, before they overpowered and killed him. The older brother Matthew was taken prisoner, and after the Indians had started to move off with their plunder and prisoners, after getting on some little distance, they all stopped to arrange some of their fixings. This Matthew Ingles not being confined, some of the Indians offended him in some way. Being a stout, strong man, there happened to be a frying pan lying near where he was. He caught hold of this pan, put his foot in the bowl of the pan, wrung off the handle, and fell to work on the Indians, and knocked them down wherever he could get in reach of them, until they so overpowered him, and got the pan handle from him. This bold, daring attempt pleased the Indians so well, that they treated him with more respect than any of the other prisoners, as long as he was with them, and he got released some years after, and returned to the country again. My father and mother continued to live in Bedford County for several years. In the meantime, the settlers were still moving to the western waters, and extending the settlements to a considerable extent west of New River. My father returned to New River with his family, and got himself settled again. Although the Indians were still harassing the frontier every season for many years after his return, his family escaped their further depredations. Although the families in the neighborhood were obliged almost every season to collect in forts, and there was one in his own house, where a good many people were collected every year. At one time there was a party of Indians, about 8 or 10, who passed by the New River settlements, and being no settlements until they got below the Blue Ridge on the head of Smith's River, they there killed and destroyed a family or two, and stole several horses to bring off their plunder they had taken, and they also took a woman and 2 or 3 children prisoners, and on their way back had camped within 6 or 7 miles of my father's fort, to rest a day, at a place where there had been a settlement and a house built. It so happened that one of the men from the fort went out the day the Indians were there on the hunt of some of their horses, and happened to discover the Indians. He returned immediately to the fort, and gave the alarm. There being several men at the place, my father raised 15 or 18 men immediately, and pursued to attack them, though it being too late in the day before the company could start, to get where the Indians were to attack them that evening. They were detained until some time in the morning of the next day, before my father and the men got to the place where the Indians had camped, and the Indians had started from that place. However, they took their trail and followed on. The Indians had not gone more than half a mile, till they stopped and had kindled a fire, and were cooking their breakfast. They, not suspecting any danger, were entirely off their guard. My father's party crawled up tolerably near, and fired on them before they knew anything of them. However, they flew to their guns, and made every resistance they could to save themselves and their property. But being overpowered by the white men, those that escaped being killed ran off, leaving all they had behind. There were 6 or 7 Indians killed, and they got several horses which were packed, and rescued the women and children prisoners. There was one of the white men killed. This being the first and only defeat which the Indians had ever met with in this section of the country. From that time they never ventured so far through the settlements again. The immigration to the west relieved the settlers about New River in a great measure of their harassed situation, and at length they enjoyed peace and prosperity. My father and mother lived and raised a small family of 5 children, 2 sons and 3 daughters, who sustained as respectable characters as any in the whole country. My father died in the year 1782, at the age of 53 years. My mother still continued to live on New River, and enjoyed an extraordinary portion of good health, after all her trials and difficulties, until the year 1815. She died at the advanced age of 83 or 84 years of age.
So that is the end of the story of Mary Draper Ingles' 800-mile escape from Kentucky along the Ohio River back to her home just west of the Allegheny Mountains in what is now Blacksburg, Virginia. The Ingles would later move to Radford, Virginia, and establish Ingles Ferry in 1762, which is a historic ferry crossing on New River. New River is the lower portion of the Kanawha River that runs through western Virginia and part of North Carolina. This ferry was attacked numerous times by Indians, usually Shawnee, and William Ingles built a blockhouse to protect it called Fort Hope. The Ingles' 4-year-old son Thomas lived for many years among the Shawnee, but he was eventually released. It appears that their 2-year-old who was captured, George Ingles, died sometime in 1755. John Ingles, Jr., who wrote this account down in 1824, was born in 1766, making him about 15 years younger than his older brother. It appears that he stayed on the Ingles farm in Radford, Virginia, and died there in 1836. The eldest son, Thomas, who was released from captivity, did not stay near the Ingles farm in Virginia because of a later attack by Shawnee Indians on his family in 1782. I will now read the following paragraph that describes these events from his Find a Grave website page. In an event reminiscent of his own capture by Indians as a child, Thomas Ingles' own family was attacked by Shawnee Indians in 1782. In the ensuing rescue, 2 of his children were killed, and wife Eleanor tomahawked so severely that a surgeon removed 13 pieces of skull from her head. Shortly after this occurrence, Thomas Ingles, his wife, and infant daughter Rhoda moved to Tennessee and settled in succession on the Watauga River at Mossy Creek and at Fort Knox, now Knoxville. There his daughter Rhoda, who escaped death, grew up and married Patrick Campbell. Subsequent to the marriage of his daughter in 1800, Thomas Ingles moved to Mississippi with some of his other children, where he lived until he died. So Thomas Ingles got away from the Shawnee after this attack and moved down to Tennessee and then to Natchez, Mississippi, where he died in 1809. He had 2 surviving children, his daughter Rhoda, who survived the Indian attack, and Thomas Ingles, Jr., who was born on Christmas Day in 1791. Thomas Ingles, Jr. was the person who asked his uncle, Colonel John Ingles, to write this account of his grandmother Mary Ingles' escape from captivity in 1755. I am now going to read a short entry from Thomas Ingles' Find a Grave page that tells some interesting facts about him and his life. When Thomas Ingles was born on December 25, 1791, in Tennessee, his father Thomas was 40 and his mother Eleanor was 36. Thomas was a worthy and honorable, though somewhat eccentric man. He wrote a sketch of his father's life. He also wrote a short autobiographical sketch of himself. He seems to have been all things by turns and nothing long. He says he studied law, medicine, theology, and politics, but did not practice any profession. He was a bookkeeper, deputy sheriff, school teacher, militia commander, trustee, treasurer, secretary, etc. of several corporations, business, religious, and literary, a merchant and a planter, but perhaps more than anything else, postmaster. In 1843 at Augusta, Kentucky, where for many years he was their postmaster, and they never had a better. He had been twice married, first to Miss Barnes, the issue being 4 sons and 3 daughters, and second to Miss Eliza H. Warren, the issue being 3 sons and 2 daughters. Some years later he moved to Cincinnati, where he died on November 21, 1863, age 72, and was buried there. So that's it for this episode, but there's a little more to the story of the attack on Draper's Meadows that we will read about in a future episode on this channel. In 1843, Letitia Preston Floyd, whose great-uncle was Colonel James Patton, who was killed in the 1755 attack, wrote her own account down of the attack on Draper's Meadow. Her account differs in a few interesting ways from John Ingles' accounts, written 19 years earlier. Letitia Floyd's account was also written for a younger family member, interested in their family's history just like Thomas Ingles, Jr. Her account tells not only about the Draper's Meadow massacre, but also countless other attacks and battles that her ancestors took part in from their arrival in the 1740s from Northern Ireland through the U.S. Revolution and the War of 1812. As you will see, she ends her letter to her nephew by telling him, "From the year 1755 to the Battle of New Orleans, your paternal ancestors unsheathed the sword and poured out their blood for this country. So stay tuned to this channel for more history of our American pioneers, and let us know in the comments if you have any thoughts about this story or if you know any more information about it." This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has been forgotten, cast aside, or deemed unworthy to discuss on history channels on TV. We try to read history from accounts written down long ago by people whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. If you'd like to support our channel and see some additional members-only videos, then you can join our Patreon page or become a YouTube channel member. Members will be recognized for their contributions to our channel at the end of each episode, and will have unlimited access to all of our members-only videos. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.